Hello, my name is Aremel, and I'm joined today by Susan Wei, the creative directors for SuperStudio. And we are very happy to have Samantha Ratnam as one of our speakers for the competition. So I'll just let Samantha introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Ratnam. I'm the leader of the Victorian Greens. I also hold the portfolios for planning at the state level, but I was also a councillor previously at the City of Moreland.
Great, thank you, Samantha, for your introduction. And now here we would like to provide you all her pre-recording.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I join you from Wurundjeri land, land that was never ceded. I pay my respects to First Nations, elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person today, but I'm so thrilled to be able to join you virtually. Firstly, congratulations to everyone who submitted their work to the competition and the winners in advance. I can't wait to see what you've produced with your creative and intelligent minds. My appreciation for the work you do comes from what you might call an outsider perspective. I'm not an architect nor a planner. I'm a social worker by trade and a politician now by profession. Now, these vocations might seem to not to be connected in many ways, but I want to share with you how I think they are and how those connections can help inform the theme that you all work with this competition. Those themes exploring the evolution of personal and community identity and how architecture can be shaped and indeed shape our identities and cultures that we live in and work in. To me, culture is an expression of our collective identities. Embarking on a career as a social worker, I didn't envisage that one day I would know so much about the impact of good design on our communities, nor become such a champion of your profession, but here I am. And this appreciation began before I even realized at a very early age. It shaped who I am today. I haven't always lived in Australia. I'm a migrant to this country, having grown up in Sri Lanka and migrating to Canada before we arrived in Australia. Sri Lanka is a developing country that has had a long history of war and conflict, and is the reason my family left. But before then, we had the joy of living within our own culture. As you can imagine, in the circumstances that the country was in, there wasn't a lot of resource for infrastructure or the built environment. As a result of little, if any, planning guidelines, the cities were congested, open space was scarce, and the environment was polluted. As a child, this had a big impact on the spaces we lived in. We ended up spending more time within our home, as backyards and parks were just not an option. Our journeys to and from school were a battle on congested roads, no matter whether you were travelling on foot, bike, car, or bus. And if this is all you know, it becomes the norm. You adjust your expectations and outlook, but it still has an impact that I didn't quite realise until much later in life. At the age of 10, our family did our first migration to Toronto, Canada. Honestly, as a kid, it felt like we'd arrived in Wonderland. The air was clean, streets weren't filled with honking horns or car pollution. There was grass and places to play on outside our apartment home. The streets were accessible with footpaths and pedestrian crossings that meant my sister and I were allowed to walk to and from school, which wasn't far away. It meant we got to know our physical community and formed a community of friends who trod the same path to and from school each day. The journey became the highlight of the day, full of stories and chatter, rather than congestion and stress. There was a library and swimming pool within walking distance from our home that meant after school and on holidays there were fun, healthy places to hang out in, places in which we formed friendships and connection and allowed us to learn and be physically active. You see why we felt like it was Wonderland. And mind you, as newly arrived migrants, we had little, so we didn't live in big fancy houses, but modest apartments. But apartments that had been built to house families and not just built to be transition boxes. Little did I realise, but as a 10-year-old, I was learning and experiencing about how our cities are built and how they function and how they can change your lives. We moved soon thereafter to Melbourne to be closer to family, and much of the wonder we experienced in Canada remained. But I did notice one big difference, that our suburbs seemed to work a bit differently here, and the one thing I noticed was the impact of distance. The suburb we moved to wasn't very wealthy. We rented a house on a semi-busy street, and it was a long way to get to school. We rode our bikes on the footpath each day because there were no safe bike paths and dodged pedestrians and inevitably had accidents along the way. The library and pools were also far away. It meant that after-school activities became less of an option. With busy working parents, as kids we started to retreat again. Without safe and accessible pathways, without local services that were close by, a child's world can contract a lot. Once again to the confines of the walls of their home, if they're lucky, to their backyards. I tell you this story because it fundamentally shaped my identity. Not having much access to the natural world previously, having access opened my eyes to how much it impacted my well-being. Fast forward 15 years and I was now a social worker working in many outer suburban areas of Melbourne. I saw the impact of the built environment, how it had an impact on the clients I worked with. And this was brought home to me even more strongly when I became a counsellor at the City of Moreland. I came to understand that how our homes, neighbourhoods and cities are designed, planned and built can change our lives, our relationship with the environment and the future of the next generation. I saw this time and time again when, as a counsellor, I sat on the committee that approved urban planning applications. In an area that was experiencing densification, we were receiving application after application for apartment buildings that proposed dwellings that had barely enough space to live in, very little natural light, and could not cater for anyone with a family that needed multiple rooms. These buildings also took their building envelope to the edge of the land boundary, with no space for green open space, and very imposing on the street below. We knew this would be compounded by the ability of developers to offset their requirement to provide open space, and also by council not being able to afford to buy land that was close by to provide parkland for the people who lived in those buildings eventually. We could see the reality before our eyes about how bad neighbourhood planning happens. It happens through 1,000 cuts. In this case, 1,000 bad quality planning applications compounded by weak or non-existent planning laws that it could actually ensure our neighbourhoods could be sustainable for the people who live in it and the environment that sustains it. There seemed to be little regard to the culture or character of a place or the desire to help shape the identity or reflect the identity of a community seemed nowhere to be found in our planning and design frameworks. But there were exceptions. And I wanted to talk to you about how something new, something courageous, and something innovative can change the way a whole city works. I can't tell you how much these new and innovative applications, the applications that actually have thought and consideration and design behind them, started to change the way we as a council started to see how our neighbourhoods could actually work. And the people behind those visionary applications, people like you, who care about what long-lasting impact their work would have on our people and planet, started to shape our neighbourhood. They were the architects and designers like you who had thought about how the building they were planning interacted with a neighbourhood that embraced it and how the natural environment could be sustained. Being in Moreland, I was lucky to witness and be part of the visionary Nightingale projects. This began as one building planning application for the Commons that had a concept about community and sustainability embedded within it. You might be familiar with this project, but these were apartments to be built to the highest environmental sustainability with consideration about how the streets below interacted with the people who lived in the building. As a counsellor, I learned about passive surveillance and how a street wall can have a big impact on community safety. These were car-free developments, the first of their kind and groundbreaking in their vision and their design. The next project in the series was for the first Nightingale projects that were built on the concept of the Commons, of fossil fuel and car-free developments that put a cap on profit to actually tackle the issue of housing affordability. Fast forward 5+ years later on, we now have a whole Nightingale precinct being constructed with more than 7 buildings in the Anstey neighbourhood of Brunswick. And why this is so significant is because of the location of the project. Prior to this project, this area was commonly regarded as an emerging concrete jungle. There were a litany of poor quality apartment buildings being built that separated people from each other through high concrete walls with little or no open green space. But the Nightingale vision started to change all of that. It's now on its way to making the Anstey precinct the most sustainable neighbourhood, dare I say it, anywhere in Victoria. My hope is that one day it will become the first car-free precinct in all of Australia. And this wasn't just about one project. What we started to see was council realising the potential for future design, planning and development in the area. It started to see this type of project as a new benchmark, and we soon started to have developer after developer putting on their Nightingale-type credentials to try and get council support for their project. We started to see a domino effect of better design being applied for at council, and indeed it is starting to shape the whole city for the better. And remember, this transformation began with one idea, one proposal, one building and one big vision, much like I'm sure we will see through the work you've submitted for the competition today. So my message and appeal to all of you is to never give up on your vision. Vision is what's transformative. You may at times feel like you're coming up against barriers or others may not support your views, but if you're passionate about what you hope to achieve, you will build allies and supporters, and you will create change. The work you're doing has the power to shape and change the lives and future sustainability of our environment and climate. Growing up in different neighbourhoods myself, some that alienated people from each other and the environment, contrasted with places that built into their design how the built environment will impact people, I know firsthand how this can change your life. Being able to access a natural environment after not being able to made me value it even more deeply. It's the reason why I started to commit my life and work to protecting our natural environment and climate and becoming a passionate advocate for both. It shaped who I am today. So I ask you, in the work you do from now onwards, in your career before you, I ask you to consider a number of key questions before you embark on any project. Will it create places for people to meet and connect? Will it afford people places to cherish and nurture the natural environment? Will it encourage more sustainable living and help people change their consumption and travel? Will your work help tackle the climate crisis we're facing? Will it do everything it can to avoid the use of fossil fuels and reduce energy consumption and use natural light and ventilation? Will your project think about the community and culture that once inhabited a place? Will it reflect our First Nations, whose culture and lives are barely reflected in any of our urban environments now? To name a street or building respecting our First Nations heritage is still very sadly very rare, but must be something we work towards, let alone the work we have to preserve the cultural heritage of our First Nations that is being destroyed at a whim by developers and corporations. If you make it your intention to commit to design with community, culture and environment at the forefront, you can shape a neighbourhood, a community and indeed a country in ways that you might not have imagined. I encourage you to do so because you are the visionaries that can shape the next generation. You can shape the identity of a generation. I wish you all the very best as you embark on this mission. Thanks again for having me today.
Thanks, Samantha, for sharing your story. You have been a social worker, a politician, and an observer of cities, and has witnessed how cities has evolved through varying cultural contexts. Haber is very lucky to be the anchor practice for a collective of like-minded architects for the latest Nightingale project, which is the Nightingale Village, the project you mentioned earlier with a collection of 7 buildings in Brunswick. As I mentioned, we are very proud, and in particular of its contribution to community and its mission towards sustainability that makes a difference. As mentioned by you, the neighborhood has evolved from the first Nightingale project to what we have now, a new village through the support of both the council and its community, not without its own barrier, of course. A new identity has been formed of the place through multiple partnerships. As earlier mentioned, architecture has the capacity for architecture to shape the culture we live and work in. For the competition, students are asked to explore the theme evolving identity. Life, like as in design, are very seldom without any barrier or complexity in our pluralistic society. We are constantly in flux, and place identity is continually evolving. Looking at the next decade, what do the 2 words of evolving identity means to you?
Thanks very much for the question. To me, it reminds me that we are in a constant state of change, and that's not something to be scared about. Certainly, when I was a counselor, a lot of people would become scared of change and therefore hold on to what they've always known as very familiar, as the kind of hallmark of what we should always aim to achieve. And look, there were certainly things that we need to preserve, and it's really important to preserve history, culture, heritage, and a lot of those things are under threat. So it is certainly something you need to be really mindful of protecting, kind of a historical character of an area, historical identity. But one thing I found was often that was used as a barrier to thinking about the future identity, the future character of a place, and how new creative ideas could actually help shape a better character of a place. So it reminds me that we shouldn't forget that change is constant. It can be a good thing too. And how do you create space for really creative, innovative, and positive change?
Thank you, Samantha. We might move on to a different question. And I was going to start by acknowledging how generous you have been in giving us your time today, but also taking the time to share your personal migration journey that began in Sri Lanka and then crossed many oceans and lands and waterways to Canada, and finally returning down south to Australia. And here you are in Melbourne, as you said. So no doubt along the way, you have collected many memories and special lessons. I was hoping to ask if you might be able to share one or two extra special lessons that might be particularly beneficial in terms of how they've helped to shape you, perhaps, in the person that you are today, and the council work that you do for the community in Melbourne. And hopefully the students who listen to some of your own journey and how it shaped you, they might be able to reflect on the competition brief that has asked them to consider reflecting on their own identities and where they've begun.
Thanks, Susan. It's a really great question. And as I mentioned in my opening address, the process and experience of migration and change inadvertently made me an observer of what differences in our kind of built environment can do to your sense of who you are, how you relate to your community, and your sense of well-being, and particularly this idea about our relationship to our natural environment. So when we don't get that kind of design on our built environment right, we can really alienate people from their natural environment, and that can have so many flow-on consequences. We're seeing it right across the world now, where people have been so disconnected from the natural environment. We're destroying it at a pace that we don't even realize, and possibly we're going to realize when it's too late. And it was that experience of being alienated from it and being denied access to it in a really meaningful way, and then having access to it, that made me realize you can't take it for granted. Not everyone has this access, and it made me really fight for it. So I remember when I was in local council, one of the things I was really mindful of was open space. Yes, we need densification. We need to infill, in terms of sustainability. That's a better outcome than kind of spreading ourselves out, further and further into expansive kind of suburbs. But at the same time, you have to keep the connection to the natural environment, because it's really bad for people and it really disconnects our connection, which we need to have with the natural environment. So I really fought hard for our environment. And, I think it's why it made me a Green, like how I then became a politician. I never thought I'd become a politician, but it's that relationship to environment. I realized you have to conserve, you have to fight for, or you lose it. And that's happening, at a mass scale now with the ecosystem decline that we're facing, the climate change that we're facing. So, my built environment really shaped who I am. And I think the other important lesson is around this theme of identity. Yes, a place has an identity. Yes, it changes. And there are a number of things that help create that identity. But the people that live in a place, that habit a place, bring their own identity. Therefore, their identity in terms of how they relate to that environment, they start to shape the culture and the identity of that place. So we have to design with that in mind, that it is in a state of flux, and particularly like in a place like Australia with a large multicultural community, a migrant population. I don't think we listen to that enough, that kind of plurality of people and identities and experiences, and that's not reflected in our built environments and our neighborhoods. So I think it's a journey that we have to embark on more and actually consciously take on, or we're going to lose the essence of who we are, and our places are not going to reflect who we want to be as people.
Thank you for the, sorry, Susan, please. Thank you for that. Maybe I'll go slightly sideways now. I know that your portfolio includes animals, and when you're talking about what you're talking about, apart from place, people, there's also the environment at large,
Yes.
which is biodiversity. Would you like to talk a little bit more about the animals? Let's speak for the animals.
Absolutely. It's really, really crucial. And when I talk about biodiversity loss and, the extinction crisis that we're facing, we are losing our plant, our animal life, our bird life at a scale that I don't think we recognize just how dire it is. And one of the key drivers of that is habitat loss. So the places where our animals and our biodiversity needs to live and to thrive. Now that happens in lots of different ways. When you lose forests, for example, which is why it's really important, when you're thinking about issues like logging, because that is about habitat destruction at this really mass scale. And then you get habitat destruction in urban environments where every park that you build over, every park that you don't create, every encroachment onto the creek from the built form has an impact on biodiversity and our natural environment. Now we need to coexist, and I'm totally acknowledge that we need to coexist. But coexistence is about giving an equal space for both and giving space for both. And I don't think we've got that balance right, which is why the kind of development outcomes often supersede the impact they have on the environment, which is bad for people and the animals and the broader biodiversity. So I think we don't have that equilibrium and balance, and we really need to consciously work on how we get that back into balance. And it's, the people behind that design who really help shape that balance, because when you champion it, other people will listen and go, oh, I've got to think about that.
Thanks again, Samantha. Maybe you should have done architecture and built environment planning. I think you should have been working in the built environment for sure.
Honestly, I didn't know that I would actually grow an interest in this area. But actually, when I started on council, I realized how important urban planning was to the well-being of people. And my interest really grew from that point.
Yeah. So you've said so many useful things, so many valuable things that we can all take inspiration from and reflect upon in, your talk. Perhaps just one final request of you, and that is touches base on something you said about suggesting to architects and urban planners to reflect on First Nations identity, culture. I personally think it's a very topical dialogue today in many forums and many contexts. Australians, particularly both new and original, if you like, are starting to reconnect to their roots and recognizing the ancient connection to the land and to the First Nations culture and heritage. So for the architects and the future planners and designers in the Superstudio today, and we've asked them to reflect and use identity as a powerful tool for their design thinking. What are your final words and advice on that, on evolving, the theme evolving identity? We started with that at the beginning. Perhaps we should just close with that as well. Some final words from you, Samantha.
Certainly. In terms of the evolution of the Australian identity, I hope that we're at a point that we finally, long overdue, recognise how much we haven't acknowledged the loss our First Nations have experienced through colonisation, what then has happened in the last 200 years to disconnect our First Nations from each other and their connection to land, which is just so fundamental to the culture of our First Nations. I think there's a growing awareness, not fast enough and not enough, but there is starting to be a consciousness raising and changing, which I'm hopeful about. You see it in those marches on the 26th of January, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets now, because I think that consciousness is raised. So I think we need to keep raising that consciousness, because with that comes a recognition of the first identity of this land, which was a First Nations identity. So I think it's really important that we never forget that. That is the basis from which we work, and we need to create spaces to hear from our First Nations and be driven by their culture, how they value the land, and how they want us to be help to be custodians alongside them now in the place that we find it. So ultimately respecting and listening and creating the spaces where we start to learn, because I think the first thing is learning. We don't know enough because, you know, the last 200 years has kind of disconnected us from our First Nations heritage and connection. So if each and every one who's listening to this can think about how in their own way they can build that consciousness into their work, I think it could have a really big impact.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions and answering them so well. We'll leave it to Aremel to wrap this session up.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, but before we wrap the session, I just want to say, Samantha, everything you said really aligned with the direction and the concept of what this competition is about. And it's very admirable to hear from a politician like you, who values design, who values the built environment. Many of these things, you know, are things that are addressed by students in architecture and in design. So it's great to hear from that. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, and on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects, Donna, and the creative team for SuperStudio, once again, thank you very much, Samantha.
Thank you so much. It's been been a pleasure to be part of your session today.
Thank you.